I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Dr. Philip Byrne, Director of the Local Government Division at the Institute of Public Administration. Again, Dr. Byrne is a leader in the field, and he's been our senior researcher for the last 20 years. We are privileged to have both Laura and Philip with us this morning, and I hand now over to Dr. Philip Byrne. Thank you.
Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how I'm going to follow that, that presentation earlier on. So I've been asked this morning to talk for 15 minutes. I don't know how I'm going to keep the 15 minutes, but I'll do my best, on the challenges facing the 4 Dublin authorities and the relationship also that the 4 Dublin authorities have with central government. And also in my presentation to show how some of these challenges are very much Dublin-specific type of challenges. So I'd be delighted to take questions later on, folks. So I'm going to start by looking at it from a number of perspectives. The first thing I want to do is just set the scene for you. Just give you a very quick couple of minutes view of local government in Ireland today and where the 4 Dublins fit in that model. And in so doing, just very quickly talk about the services that they provide and how they're funded. Now, I could spend all day on that, but I'm just going to do that in 5 minutes. And then focus in on some of the key challenges that each of the local authorities, and specifically the Dublin authorities, are facing currently and perhaps will face into the near future. And these challenges will be very important challenges, I think, for any new directly elected mayor when that happens. And then to show what sort of relationship the Dublin authorities and all the local authorities have with central government. Okay, just to set the scene for you very, very quickly, I'll just put this total slide up. Local government that we have today is over 120 years up and running. It formally came into being in 1898 with a piece of legislation called Local Government in brackets Ireland Act. And from the early 1900s right up until a very important year, which is 2014, the model evolved. And it changed dramatically in 2014. And the very early years we very much mirrored the British model. Right up until the year 2014, we had developed 114 local authorities. That was made up of 29 county councils, 5 city councils and 80 town councils. But a piece of legislation changed the landscape completely, where 80 town councils were abolished and a number of local authorities were merged. And what we have today is 25 county councils, and we've 3 city councils, including Dublin, Cork and Galway. And then we've 3 merged local authorities that were former local authorities in their own basis. So we've Limerick City and Limerick County as one local authority called Limerick City and County Council, Waterford City and Waterford County as one local authority called Waterford City and County Council, and Tipperary County Council, formerly 2 local authorities, North Tipperary and South Tipperary. We currently have about 28,500 staff working in the local government system. That represents approximately 1/10 of public sector numbers. Before the reform and in the height of the time in local government, the greatest number ever in local government was 38,000 staff. We're now down 10,000 from that, and that was a cull that happened during the last recession. We have currently 949 elected members working in the 31 local authorities. 63 elected members in Dublin City Council, 55 in Cork County Council. They're the 2 biggest local authorities out of the 31. And then in the rest of the other 29 local authorities, we have a maximum of 40 elected members and a minimum of 18. And that's all laid out in the legislation, the 2014 Act. And that's based on a formula of 1 elected member representing, on average, 4,830 head of population. And the interesting thing about that is before the reform there was 1,600 elected members, 1,627 to be precise, because elected members were on the boards, or were the board of governors of the town councils, but they're now gone and they were independent local authorities. We have elections every 5 years, as you know, and the last elections was in 2019, and the next elections will be 2024, May 2024. So we have a new council every 5 years, basically. And on average, about 1/3 of elected members are newly elected every term, on average. Okay, in relation to the services that local authorities provide. Now, I won't get into this in huge detail because I'll be here for the day. but they provide services on what's known as 8 service division bases. And within each of these, there's a whole load of sub-services. So on average, there's about 100 different types of services provided by the 31 local authorities. So I'll just give you an example of one, and maybe at coffee time we can talk about more. But if we take housing and building, so what the local authorities do there, they assess people's needs for social housing support. They put them on waiting lists. They prioritise them on waiting lists, and then they provide them with some sort of social housing support. Traditionally, it used to be local authority houses that they built, and now in the new national plan they're pushing towards that again. But in the last 15 years or so, they've been using the private rented sector with the recently developed HAP scheme, before that the RAS scheme, and another scheme called social leasing. Then when they put people into, give them social housing support, they charge rent for that. And then they deal with other issues in housing, like, for example, antisocial behaviour is a big issue for local authorities. They deal with marginalised groups, the likes of homeless people, elderly people, disabled people, travelling community, the Roma community. And they deal with many other things. They have an enforcement role in each of the service areas. So the big enforcement role in housing is the whole area of going into the private rented sector and inspecting properties for standards of accommodation. They also provide grants. For example, they give housing adaptation grants to elderly people, to people with disabilities, and people with mobility problems as well. So they provide a wide range of services in each of those areas. It often amazes me how the general public really doesn't know that. So they're pushing a communication process now to let everybody know what's involved. In relation to how they're funded, for example, in relation to Dublin City Council, for their day-to-day expenditure based on their budget for 2022, they're expecting to spend €1.1 billion across those 8 service divisions, 1.1 billion, of which 497 million is on housing and building. And that very much reflects the whole philosophy of the government. And again, I don't have time to get into the other areas, but if you look at the other Dublins, for example, which I'll show you now, I'll come down to it in a sec. The other Dublins, 282 million this year for South Dublin, Dunleary Rathdown 214 million, and Fingal 302 million. That just shows you the scale of Dublin City. So out of the 28,000 staff, 5,000 staff work in Dublin City, and out of that, the total budget for day-to-day expenditure, or as it's known in local government, revenue expenditure, Dublin City is about a fifth of it. So there's about €5 billion being spent in 2022, of which €1 billion has been spent by Dublin City. That just shows you how specific the remit Dublin has vis-a-vis the rest of the country. For example, Carlow County Council, their budget's about 50 million. So that shows you the difference in scale. So just very quickly then, how are local authorities funded for day-to-day expenditure? There's 4 sources of funding. Commercial rates is a major source. They can charge for services and goods like housing rent, for example, planning application fees, fire charges, etc. And then, of course, they're very dependent on the centre for grants and subsidies. They're called specific state grants and subsidies. That means they can't use them for discretionary purposes, and the local property tax. So just to show you, for example, for Dublin City for 2022, they're expecting to get in 367 million from the ratepayers, commercial rates, 329 million in relation to service charges, like car parking and so on, and planning application fees, housing rent fees and so on. 376 million for government grants and subsidies, and the local property tax 23 million. And then 35 million they have as a credit balance. Now, just moving on then to the challenges, folks. Now, I could spend all day on that, as you can appreciate, and I'd be delighted to take questions in a few minutes. But just in relation to the challenges, there are many, many challenges across those service areas, specifically relevant to the Dublin local authorities. For example, in relation to housing, There are specific construction targets now to build local authority houses. And this is based on a very recently developed national policy on housing, which is called Housing for All, that was launched last year. So for the country, over the next 5 years, the document said that we will be constructing 47,000 social units. In relation to the 4 Dublins, they will be constructing over nearly 30% of that. So, for example, in relation to Dublin City, between 2022 and 2006, over 9,000 units. For South Dublin, over 3,000 units. For Fingal, over 3,000 units. And 2,000 units for Dunleary, Rathdown County Council. In relation to homelessness, which is a major challenge, for example, for the government and indeed for local authorities, for the greater Dublin metropolitan area, we hear figures nearly every day on the news about homeless people, but it's estimated that there's currently over 4,000 homeless people in the greater Dublin metropolitan area, which is a huge percentage of the total number of homeless people in Ireland. About 64% actually of the total population. But just to say, to address that challenge, the 4 Dublins are providing a shared service to deal with this, and fabulous shared service called the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive. And also the AHBs, the approved housing bodies, have a major role in that area as well. Plus the homeless units in each of the local authorities, plus the homeless action teams as well. Just to say there's a massive amount of work being done in that area. Also, another big challenge is the priority groups. So the government have identified in relation to housing 4 key priority groups that local authorities must take into consideration when providing social housing support. Elderly, disabled, the travelling community, the Roma community, etc. And by God, they do that. And they do that in their allocation scheme and their housing needs assessment scheme as well. Other kind of major challenges for the Dublins and indeed for the rest of the system is arrears. So, for example, housing rents arrears is a big challenge. And also, I meant to say to you, local authorities provide loans to people to buy their houses. They're the lender of last resort. And there has been a significant amount of housing loans arrears as well. But to address that, local authorities have set up debt management units, and very active ones in the 4 Dublins. And also for housing loans arrears have put into place mortgage arrears resolution plans. And I could spend all day just on the whole area of housing, for example. Other major challenges facing local authorities and facing the Dublins on housing is the whole area of antisocial behaviour. That's a huge challenge. But again, to address that challenge, local authorities are doing a great job, and particularly the likes of Dublin City and the other Dublins. They work very closely with, for example, the police. There's things called joint policing committees to address homeless activities. Plus, they have certain powers in doing so. And of course, the elected members are very active here, and they have a key reserved function in that area, which is called the antisocial behaviour strategy. Other areas then, for example, the whole area of using the private rented sector, the whole area of the Housing Assistance Payment Scheme, the RAS scheme, social leasing scheme. The big challenge for that, and it's a major part of government policy, is the supply of units in the private rented sector to do this. But there's a lot of people that would believe that because there's big issues for people once they're in the private rented sector, they can't buy their home. So home ownership is a big challenge, and that's why we're seeing housing construction now happening, because once somebody is in a local authority house, they have the opportunity down the road to purchase that house. So just moving on to another area like road transportation and safety. What are the challenges and what is specific in relation to the Dublin area? A number of them. So, for example, in relation to Dublin, and the 4 Dublins, one of the major challenges that they have to do is to try and implement what's in, again, a national policy. And there's a very big national policy in relation to spatial development in Ireland for the next 22 years. It's called the National Planning Framework 2040, where there's huge targets to transform this country in terms of spatial development, and particularly in the area of housing, but particularly in the area of transportation. So, for example, one of the major targets in it is to have a metro, and a metro linking Sandyford and Swords via Dublin Airport. And that has been on the cards a long time, and there's been a lot of discussion about this in the news, etc., where they were hoping that this would be done by the end of this decade. They're pushing it out a little bit to the next decade, but I think at some stage it will be done, and this has huge implications for the Dublins. This has been on the cards for a long time. In fact, back in the mid-noughties, they were talking about having an underground station in Stephen's Green, where we'd have 2 metro lines linking the Dart, the Lewis, and heavy rail right to Dublin Airport in 17 minutes. Don't know whether that's ever going to happen, but I do think there will be a metro at some stage linking Sandyford and Swords via Dublin Airport. So from the Dublin's geographical perspective, that's crucial that they facilitate that. There's many other targets in relation to roads, transportation and safety. For example, the shift away from the whole carbon-intensive propulsion systems. So and that's to meet our CO2 emission targets in relation to climate change. And that's, again, this idea of the metro, but it also brings in the DART expansion, and it also brings in the Bus Connect programmes. And again, quite specific to the Dublin local authorities. So definitely transportation is a big ticket item, and I would imagine for a directly elected mayor, this will be a major challenge. For example, this idea of private cars coming into the centre non-stop. They've been trying to deal with this, routine trips. And then the problems that causes problems with CO2 emissions, causes problems with congestion, and the whole push towards the whole area of walking and cycling and the Bus Connect programmes, etc., that I mentioned to you. So that's just for example, a few challenges in land, in road transportation and safety. Massive challenges in the whole area of environment and water. Massive, and again, I could spend a whole day here. The whole area of water and wastewater treatment. We have, certainly for the Dublin metropolitan area and the Dublin region, is facing infrastructural challenges here. Definitely in relation to the demand and as our population increases for high quality drinking water, and particularly in relation to future population growth, and in relation to the problems we've had, for example, with water conservation. So for the Dublin region, the whole area of the Ringsend water treatment plant is a major priority in that regard, and particularly a major priority for Irish Water. So Irish Water have taken over water services, but local authorities, from a day-to-day basis through a service level agreement, provide the day-to-day services they always did, and the local authorities then are paid back by Irish Water, including the staff costs as well. Many other problems in the environment area, the whole area of climate change, waste management, and for the Dublin region, litter pollution and control. That's a major challenge. So, for example, since all the local authorities, with the exception of a small part of Dublin City, have moved away from waste collection, a lot of people aren't availing of private waste collection services and are dumping their rubbish and fly tipping, not just in the streets in the Dublin region, but also in out, for example, in South Dublin, up in mountainous areas. A major challenge from an enforcement point of view there. I could go on, for example, with many other challenges, but that's just a flavour of them. I would argue the two biggies for local government, and particularly for the Dublin regions, the challenges would resound around the whole area of housing and building and transportation. Major challenges, but of course in the other areas as well. Just to conclude then, the relationship with the centre. Well, there's a huge relationship. First of all, the main central relationship is with the Department of Housing, Planning and Local Government. They're the parent department to the local authorities. And they are a policy maker. So as I mentioned earlier on, they have developed many national policies. I mentioned Housing for All in relation to the housing area. I mentioned the National Planning planning framework in relation to planning and so on. They're also the legislator. So, for example, they've been producing a significant amount of legislation for local government. For example, in relation to housing, there's over 12 primary acts, and then there's a significant amount of secondary legislation in the form of statutory instruments. And one of the big things, for example, in relation to legislation, there's a huge amount of EU law in the form of EU directives and EU regulations that have come on local authorities. And the way they're brought into force, and EU regulations and EU law in the form of directives takes precedence on member states' national law. And the Custom House, that's what I call it, that's where the department is based, the majority of the department. The Custom House have been very active over the last 20 years in bringing them into force through statutory instruments. But also they're a major funder to local authorities. As I showed you earlier on, for day-to-day expenditure, about 30% of day-to-day expenditure comes from grants and subsidies, for both current grants, day-to-day expenditure, and for capital grants as well. Also, they have a very big role, for example, in controlling staff numbers. That's a major thing. So no local authority can go ahead and recruit an extra 100 people without the imprimatur of the Custom House. Then you have, for example, within the Custom House as well, a very scrutiny role. So, for example, within the Custom House, you have the Local Government Audit Service, and they're the external auditor to the 31 local authorities. Also, adjacent to the Custom House, or working with the Custom House, is a newly formed scrutiny body called NOAC, the National Oversight Audit Commission, and they're there to monitor and scrutinise the performance of local authorities. But on top of that, local government is also dealing with many other central departments. So, for example, they get funding from a whole load of central departments, the likes of, for example, Department of Transport, of course, Department of Finance, and then subnational organisations. So, for example, in relation to current grants and capital grants for roads, they get funding from Transport Infrastructure Ireland. Also, they deal with the revenue commissioners. So, for example, one of the key sources of funding, the revenue accounts. So, revenue accounts, every local authority has a revenue account and a capital account. The revenue account tracks all the day-to-day expenditure of the local authorities in relation to the 8 service divisions, including staff costs. And one of the 4 main sources I mentioned were commercial rates, service charges, government grants and subsidies, and the local property tax. But in relation to the local property tax, that's not collected by the local authorities. That's collected by revenue, the revenue commissioners. They also collect the plastic shopping bag levy and the landfill levy, and those levies are used to go into a fund that's managed in the Custom House called the Environment Fund, to push initiatives in the environment area, particularly on the whole area of the hierarchical approach to waste management, and particularly in the area of recycling. And finally, they deal on a day-to-day basis with a huge amount of subnational organisations. For example, the IPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the HSA, the Health and Safety Authority, the HSE. And these guys have a huge monitoring and enforcement role with the relationship with local government. Now, I'm sorry for overshooting my time, Chair, but I'll stop now and I'd be delighted to take questions later on. Thank you.